So, an anomaly just happened. Last month in September, in what is usually an uneventful month for movies, not one, but two animated robot movies came out just a week apart. One that I couldn't care less about initially, and one that many people like myself were absolutely stoked for, with it having the potential to be DreamWorks Animation's next masterpiece. Both of these movies were helmed by experienced animation directors, who both worked under Disney before moving over to competing studios. Both movies also got great reviews in the end, and they also had their own panels at San Diego Comic-Con that I attended. It makes you wonder, were people all of a sudden just craving for animated movies about robots for some reason? Nah, I'm sure it was just a coincidence. Or was it? Anyway, I don't really have much else to say for the intro I wrote, so let's just kick things off with... More like Transformers 1 out of 10! Like seriously, the clips that were shown in the marketing look so lowest common denominator, and like a feature-length version of those shitty toy commercial kid shows you'd find on TV in the 2010s. It's almost like Paramount was trying to convince people not to see this. Even when I attended the Comic-Con panel, where they showed exclusive clips from the movie, I still couldn't care less. However, when I decided to make this video, I thought of checking out both movies, cause why not? So what'd I think of the movie after purchasing a ticket, sitting in a theater, and watching it till the very end? Huh, that wasn't bad. Like, I still definitely have my issues with it, and I think the script definitely could have used some work in places, but I still see the heart put in this movie by both the cast and artists involved. It tells the story of how the robotic planet Cybertron was formed by this almighty transformer named Primus, while these two minor robots called Orion Pax and D-16, who serve this big blue guy called Sentinel Prime, are entering a race to prove themselves more than what they are, and they somehow are tasked with finding the Matrix, where they're joined by Keegan-Michael Key Robot and Scarlett Johansson Robot. Sorry, I don't remember their names. The rest of the plot deals with twists, betrayals, crazy hijinks, you know, whatever you usually expect from a big epic movie like this. I was admittedly kind of put off at first by the amount of exposition. Exposition! As someone not familiar with this universe or franchise. Sadly, the only relationship I have with it is the Michael Bay movies.
Stop lubricating the man!
Which, by the way, anyone who wants to watch those movies anytime over this, those people are just cowards. But I was still getting somewhat invested in Orion and his relationship with his best friend, and how they were both being rewarded for their struggles and failures. But the movie actually started to get more entertaining as the journey began, and learning more about the lore of the universe and the emotional moments paid off for the most part, especially near the climax. The voice acting is pretty solid because Brian Tyree Henry being in literally anything is always a plus, and I actually wasn't distracted by Hemsworth or any of the other celebrity casting for the most part. Keegan-Michael Key plays Keegan-Michael Key, and honestly is one of the three actors that has to be cast in every animated movie nowadays. Although he is better than Awkwafina and Chris Pratt, so credit where credit's due. I just don't think the movie was very funny though. Like, the family right behind me was chuckling and laughing every time Keegan's character did something stupid, which I think is expected from moms bringing their kids to a movie, but I was just silent every time it happened. But honestly, I think what saved this movie in the end for me was just how awesome in particular the last 20 minutes were. Like, there was some good action and all before that, but the last quarter of the movie really hits hard. The twist at the end was predictable, but only made the main duo's relationship all the more intriguing yet sad. And also it's worth noting that the synopsis for this movie on any site you can find just spoils the twist near the end, which I guess if you're a diehard fan of this franchise, you probably saw it coming a mile away. But for a general audience member who has no familiarity or connection with this universe and is going into it as a movie, that feels very short-sighted. The animation was well done for the most part. A lot of it in the first quarter looked competent but nothing earth-shattering, but the nighttime scenes really pop, which I think warrants the price of admission alone. It's a movie I had a good time with, and wouldn't mind watching it again on my own volition. I also think it's Josh Cooley's best movie, because the other movie he directed was Toy Story 4, and that movie's pretty mid. I do feel kinda bad for trashing it, but it's not like I owe an apology for saying the movie looked bad. That's entirely on the studio and marketing team for their failure to get anyone interested. But the fact the movie isn't doing so hot at the box office right now probably means there isn't gonna be enough room for a sequel. Like, it's gonna make close to what Mutant Mayhem did last year, but that movie was also slightly cheaper to make, and this one is gonna grow slightly less. And I feel bad for the people who really like this and want to see more of these characters. Like, I'd rather see a sequel to this than Shrek 9 or Minions 12 or Toy Story 634. But it is what it is. Now on to the other robot movie. Wild Robot has been on my radar for almost the entire year so far, unsurprisingly. Everyone was gushing over how unique it looked from the trailers, with it obviously riding off the coattails of Spider-Verse, Nimona, Mutant Mayhem, Puss in Boots, and you know the rest. The last 2 times I talked about DreamWorks as a studio were both pretty negative. But why is that? Well, I can't deny they're one of the most important studios in the animation business today that have delivered some undeniably sensational movies. They just haven't been doing so good lately. With the massive layoff the company saw, to the level of inconsistency in regards to the quality of their movies recently, which I will admit has always been attributable to the studio since its foundation, but it's more disappointing in more recent times, because their solid movies from 2022 were followed by 3 not just mediocre but really subpar movies. And it's really undeniable how much Universal has hurt the company since their acquisition. With that said, their highs since then have been some of the highest highs the studio has seen in its entire history, and Wild Robot is certainly in that high category. There's a lot to love about this movie not only visually but thematically as well, which shouldn't be too surprising considering it's from Chris Sanders, the director of Lilo and Stitch and How to Train Your Dragon, which are some of my favorite animated movies ever. And even though he co-directed both of those with Dean DeBlois, the fact that he was able to solely direct a film like this shows how much of an amazing talent the guy has. The film tackles a lot regarding found family, and more importantly, how our original purpose or heritage doesn't necessarily define us, but the people who are there for us through thick and thin that do. The forest animals are put off by the titular robot as soon as she lands on their island, and kind of throw her around in really mean-spirited ways, but that's an aspect I truly appreciate about this movie. It never sugarcoats the way some of us can be perceived by others, and portrays the setting and animals around our 3 main characters in brutally honest ways. It's become something of a necessity for recent DreamWorks movies to have A-list celebrities as part of their voice cast, as part of a mandate by Universal, but the casting in this movie is really top-notch. Not only does Lupita Nyong'o give a really friendly and soothing performance as Roz, no, not that Roz, who could have easily gotten on your nerves after a while, but the way she balances her demeanor really brings the character to life. There's also Pedro Pascal, Bill Nighy, hell, even Mark Hamill I initially forgot was in this, and he was still a lot of fun to listen to. There's 2 animated movies this reminds me of in positive ways, which are Lilo and Stitch and Finding Nemo actually. Lilo and Stitch shouldn't be too surprising considering Sanders directed that movie too, as I mentioned before. Both films delve into the themes of found family and characters that are outcast by their respective societies. One scene that always stuck out to me in Lilo and Stitch specifically is when Stitch is out reading the story about the ugly duckling, which is clearly a metaphor for how he views himself, as well as how he's viewed by society around him. The gosling that Roz raises in the movie goes through a similar arc as well, as when he grows up, he's a lot smaller than the other geese around him, and neglected because of who raised him. They both explore similar themes, but I think it's the way that Wild Robot does it that separates it from the former. Brightbill, which is the name of the gosling, is raised by Roz, and their differences from the pack that surrounds them make them both outcasts. I like to think of the story as, what if Stitch raised a child of his own? Where that film obviously had its character moments expressed through the lens of siblinghood, Wild Robot is at its center a mother-son story, where their unusual characteristics only makes them feel closer by the end. The film also reminded me of Finding Nemo in a way, especially since both films explore the grief of loss and death. Both Marlin and Nemo definitely changed over the course of the story and learn to love each other for who they are, even though Marlin admittedly goes through the most character growth since he realizes that he has to let his son grow up and make decisions for himself. This film also kind of goes into that, as Roz has to make a necessary sacrifice near the end, but it's not in a way that truly breaks any of her friends and loved ones' hearts. We get to see Roz become a lot more human over the course of the story, which is fairly typical in a lot of these sci-fi movies, but in this case, it's pretty unique since it's from the perspective of the titular robot, rather than someone else. Sanders himself said that Studio Ghibli was a huge influence in the movie's story, and My Neighbor Totoro in particular, and the movie's warm and fantastical feel definitely gives off the vibes of a family-friendly Ghibli film, like Spirited Away or even Nausicaa as well. But make no mistake, even though I'm comparing this to other films that came out before, it is very much its own unique package. I watched this movie twice so far, and the second viewing really made me appreciate the musical score all the more. I don't know who this composer is, but he did a fantastic job. The entire movie, according to Sanders, was all hand-painted except for the titular robot itself. And it's especially apparent in a scene where Roz and the fox that she befriends tells the gosling a bedtime story. It has a very dreamlike quality to it that makes it all the more visually wondrous. This is most likely going to win the Oscar for Best Animated Film next year, if that means anything to you. Which would be nice since DreamWorks hasn't won the award since nearly 2 decades ago with Wallace and Gromit: The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which was technically an Aardman Code production, so I don't think that really counts. So before that, you would have to go all the way back to the first Shrek, which we all know was the very first movie to win the Oscar for that category. Also, I think it's funny that the evil corporation that owns Roz in the movie is named Universal Dynamics, which my headcanon is that's supposed to be DreamWorks' big fuck you to Universal for shutting down their in-house animation studio. Which, by the way, this is the last completed film from their original studio, before being forced to outsource their animation from other companies for all their upcoming movies. So unless they get their old buildings back, this film will have to go out as the original DreamWorks Studios swan song. As you've heard from everyone, it is definitely a film worth seeing in theaters. Though it is at the end of the day a film marketed to kids and families, it's still a poignant picture nevertheless. I'm not sure how well it's going to do financially, but it'd be nice to see it become a sizable hit in a year that's mostly been reliant on animated sequels. But it's still gonna be doing a hell of a lot better than Transformers 1, because that only had a week as the only family movie for parents to take their kids to. And even still, I think even if Transformers 1 came out months before this did, I still think most kids would still rather see this than that. Let's be real. Transformers 1 was a good movie that clearly was made for its loyal fan base, but honestly might struggle to entertain most general audiences. Wild Robot's much simpler story not only has much more universal appeal, but I think speaks to kids and parents in much deeper and more resonant ways. Again, this isn't a dunk on Transformers 1, but that movie was already setting itself up for failure in more ways than one. It's funny looking back on how many acclaimed animated robot movies there are, from Iron Giant to WALL-E, because the movie isn't quite the commercial flop that the former was, but not the critical darling that something like WALL-E was. It kind of sits comfortably in between. I'd still recommend both movies, but I think if Transformers 1 made its script a tad more cohesive, we could have had 2 banger films in a row. But in the end, we had one pretty good robot movie and one utterly fantastic one. So whichever you prefer, they're definitely enjoyed by a ton of people. There are still other animated films coming out this year that could be better than Wild Robot, but I'm still confident it'll remain one of my favorite movies this year, period. Oh right, I forgot Robot Dreams came out last year. Maybe people just have a thing for animated robots after all.